Welcome to Human Centrics with me, Al.
And me, Gary.
Together we're bringing you regular podcasts which provide some food for thought from a humanist perspective. This one is the first of several we're planning to do on religion, given it's such a fertile and you might even say loaded topic for many humanists. In fact, there's such a lot of ground to cover, it was difficult to know where to start, but we decided to begin with religion as a control mechanism and the appeal to religious authority, which tends to be inculcated in people in childhood. That certainly seems to be a big part of religion's hold over people's belief systems and thought processes, so we thought we'd begin there. We should also define at the outset what we mean by humanist and humanism. So let's take the Oxford reference definition of humanism, which says it is a rationalist outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. That seems a good starting point for a discussion about religion. And from the humanist point of view, one of the first questions which comes to mind is why we might want to subject ourselves to a religious worldview, given that it often tends to be anti-scientific or at least pre-scientific, and imposes a morality that in some cases can be very difficult to justify rationally. The question that arises as a humanist is why we would be willing to relinquish our freedom of thought in this manner. And Gary, you have some strong views on this. I know that it tends to begin in childhood. You and I both grew up with exposure to a Christian religious worldview, a fairly traditional one, I would guess, although mine was possibly more progressive than yours. And even though I think a lot of these points that we're going to cover apply across all manner of different religions, it's probably best to reference from our own experience and go from there. So, Gary, tell us a bit about your experience of religion as a kid and whether you ever found it convincing or not, because some people grapple in their youth with the question of whether or not they should adopt these beliefs for life. And indeed, I know some people who've grappled with these questions their entire life, whereas other people can be quite dismissive of it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you grew up in a country town, so in a more isolated environment than me, whereas I grew up in the city. So, what was your and you had in your family you had missionaries on your mother's side of the family?
My mother's side of the family were missionaries in Samoa.
So in that there was, I know you had a grandmother who was very religious and went to church every Sunday.
Yes, she did.
So that would have been your main exposure to it, would have been going to church with her.
Yes, that was
right?
pretty well my only exposure to it. And she was, in a child's view, as I saw her then, a bit of a figure of fun. And that was mainly enabled by my parents, who didn't take a very religious worldview at all. They didn't expose me to religion. The only religious exposure I did get was through my grandmother. And in that way, it sort of was more a thing of comic as opposed to something that was solemn and serious.
So would you say then you were kind of prejudiced against taking it seriously because you had the one religious person in the family was kind of made fun of for being religious? So did that kind of give you a prejudice against it?
Well, I don't really see it as a prejudice per se. I guess I see it more as a different perspective. And it's a perspective that isn't rooted in orthodoxy either. It's a perspective, as we said before, built on the comical aspect of it. I mean, a whole bunch of people sitting there listening to a man out the front who seems incredibly cloistered from society, listening to all the things that he has to say, and watching people's reactions and watching people absorb all this information in a seemingly totally uncritical fashion.
So even as a little kid, so how old are we talking about when you were going
I must
to
have been about 10, I suppose.
So even as a 10-year-old kid, you saw it as funny. You didn't.
Yeah, well, I saw it's
So
funny. I used to watch sort of the ladies singing the hymns and things like that, and smile because they. I know it's easy to sort of put an adult perspective on your childhood thoughts, but it seemed to me that there was some kind of competition amongst the ladies, for example, just to who could be the best singer, and I kind of thought, well, in a way, that's not necessarily in line with the teachings of the sermon of the day.
Okay, so what about the sermon? Do you think they were listening to the sermon and taking it seriously?
I think some were, but I think a lot of people, I mean, obviously I can't say for sure, but a lot of people seemed like they were sitting there passive to what was going on and just let it almost wash over them. It's not as if you could read or look at people's faces and see any kind of reaction to what was being said. It almost seemed to me like to be something endured.
Well, see, that's a very different perspective from my perspective as a kid, but I think the difference is that when I went along to church, I went along with my mum. She decided to start going. I mean, I'd always gone to Sunday school and things like that, and my cousins had always gone to church, and we lived near each other, and because they were my mum's brother's kids, and they were going, and they were a bit older than me. I think my mum's brother said to her, "Oh, you should send Alex to the same church," and so it was a family thing, and maybe a bit competitive or whatever. So
that's basically what I was saying with the singing in the hymns.
Yes,
very competitive.
But there was a kind of, I thought as a kid, a kind of a gravitas associated with it. I mean, that because all the adults were taking it seriously. I think that's why I didn't see it as comical. Yes, there were women that was singing, in ridiculous operatic falsettos and things like that. That was quite comical. But there was a seriousness to it, I thought. I mean, you obviously never.
No,
got
it
that.
was quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah.
I didn't find it solemn at all. It just seemed as though it was what people did.
Yeah.
It's what they felt they needed to do within the structure of the small country town. It's almost as though it was some kind of club.
See, I want to pick up on the thing about the small country town, because I think that makes a difference as well, because I think you said before that the ministers or the preachers or whoever they were seemed kind of cloistered from society.
Oh, yeah.
But why do you get that impression? Because of how you saw them around the town, like interacting with people, like when they weren't in church?
Yeah,
You thought they were ineffectual or something?
Well, they just didn't seem... Well, again, I'm extending right back to a 10-year-old child.
Yeah.
But then, obviously, that perspective has been built upon...
But 10-year-old kids can be very insightful, actually,
sure.
and see things that adults choose not to see.
Yeah.
Kids can be very honest.
I just saw a very...
brutally honest, actually. So it's an interesting perspective. So...
Well, I certainly saw a difference in the way they presented themselves to other... members of the community.
Yeah.
They kind of assumed a certain otherworldliness in the way they presented themselves. And I thought that was very interesting. And I didn't really understand it, but...
You mean they were off with the pixies?
Yeah, they didn't seem like they were really connected on a deep level with what was actually going on in the community. It seemed almost they were sort of an overarching, a bridge to another world's perspective of it. Of what was happening.
So are you kind of saying that you think maybe they were in those roles because that was the only sort of thing they could do?
Well, yes. I guess I have thought that.
Yeah.
Not to be unkind.
No. We're talking about these specific people that you knew as a kid. We're not saying it applies to everyone, but I'm just...
Well, they never gave the impression that if there were a real crisis... that
they'd
be able
to
take the lead and step in and solve the issue, definitely from a humanist point of view.
Well, which you would hope they would be able to do if it came to the crunch.
I guess on a few occasions where I did see them interact with members of the public, it was more a matter of offering things that didn't seem to be beneficial at all.
Oh,
they were just
gratuitous
words.
Or?
Well, more just sort of like, along the lines of what you hear from the United
Platitudes.
Yeah, what you hear from the United States all the time, thoughts and prayers. And I remember always thinking that that's not necessarily something helpful or direct. It's like it's not direct assistance, I would have thought.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose the point is that the people in these institutions are just human beings, after all.
And that makes it even more incumbent upon them to, connect with, you would think, their humanity. And in a lot of instances, I thought that they left the humanity on the side and passed themselves over to their religiosity.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the part of the problem is that people elevate these people to a position of authority, and that's what we said at the outset about the appeal to religious authority.
It is authority. There's no question about that.
You're taught as children to respect that institute. Well, you weren't, but
no,
a lot of us are taught as children to respect that institution and that institutional authority. I mean, you can take it to very strong extremes. I mean, if you look at Catholic teachings and the teaching about the Pope being infallible when he speaks ex cathedra. I mean, that's a very extreme example, but to actually claim that any human being can ever, speak infallibly about anything, is certainly not what we would consider a humanistic perspective.
No, definitely not.
But I mean, I should caveat that, as the Catholic Church do, caveat it with the fact that there are all these extreme conditions around when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, and it has to be ratified, and it has to be this, and it has to be that. So they actually are hedging their bets, because the only time he ever actually does make an ex cathedra pronouncement, it's all been vetted and signed off 6 ways to Sunday. So
yeah,
how convincing is that as somebody actually, he's not ever speaking infallibly off the cuff, as it were.
That's right.
Which is interesting.
Yeah,
one might say.
Yeah, well, that's right.
I mean, when you look at it like that, it does seem a bit absurd to be elevating people within the institution into a status that's, well beyond that of even a politician or a world leader. I mean, nobody is unwilling to criticize a politician or claim that they're infallible, unless it was, the Emperor of Japan springs to mind back in the days of World War II, when they... But again, that's the same thing, because the Japanese people believed the emperor was a god. And then, of course, when he had that humiliation of having to surrender, he actually, as part of the whole process, had to come out to the Japanese people and say, I'm not a god, I'm just a man.
Yeah. Well, there's this element, too, of it not being something that's up for question. It's kind of, it exists, it is... not to be questioned. And certainly the way people act towards it and behave, it certainly demonstrates that fact, because they don't feel like it's their role as parishioners or as people who subscribe to any kind of religious denomination. They don't seem to feel that it's incumbent upon them to participate at all in understanding the origins of any of the teachings.
No, well, that's the thing that always
it's as though
struck
it's
me.
almost
That's the thing I was always
in stone.
Fascinated by, because when I was at uni, I did religious studies and biblical studies, because I grew up thinking that this was an important subject, that if all these people believed in it, it was important to decide whether it was true or not. And if it was important to decide whether it was true or not, the only way you could decide whether it was true or not was actually study it and find out what the origins of the teachings were, and whether that struck you as being a convincing source of authority or not. And with the way my brain works, I kind of just thought, well, that's what anyone would do.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not what anyone would do. In fact, most people in the religion know very little about it.
Yeah.
And, I have met very few Christians who have read as much of the Bible as I have. In fact, I don't know if I've met any Christian who's read as much of the Bible as I have. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about lay people. I'm not talking about ministers who it's their vocation and they're meant to do it, for a living. But just a parishioner or a member of the congregation or whatever, they don't. It's not something they seem to do, or if they do seem to do it, they do it from a very superficial or literalist perspective, of course, which has got its own problems.
Yeah, well, my experience, what I see, my perspective, is that a lot of people just take the primal needs attitude toward religion. It's more a matter of it offers them comfort, it offers them some kind of safety. It gives them the connections with other people feeling perhaps the same way they do about life, the uncertainty of life.
But it's a pre-scientific worldview, that informs Judeo-Christianity. I mean, if you're looking at, and we'll cover this, in more detail in future podcasts, but certainly if you're looking at, the Old Testament, you look at, how long ago that was written, and even the New Testament, these were people who obviously didn't have the knowledge that we have now. And yet, when I've been around people who have talked about, the stories in the New Testament, for example, because they've been trying to convert me or whatever, they seem to look at it as though the people that lived 2,000 years ago were just like us, going about their daily lives, with the same level of knowledge and the same level of education and the same level of insight or whatever, but they just happen to be living 2,000 years ago. That seems to be how they imagine it. They don't stop and think that most people couldn't read or write, that people's whole worldview was very, very primitive compared to what ours is today, that people's life expectancy was so much lower, all kinds of things. And that the people that were living at the time of Jesus were living in a world where there were all kinds of competing religions and cults and ideas about this and ideas about that were all around them. And that people were influenced by all kinds of things that most of us have completely forgotten about. But those things would inform people's worldviews.
Yeah.
I wanted to make the point that it's a pre-scientific worldview, but that doesn't mean that everyone that is a Christian takes a literalist perspective, of course. And I've met some Christians who are very progressive and who tend to look at the whole thing much more metaphorically than they would literally. So I guess that's different from my experience growing up from yours, because by the sound of it, your grandmother and the church that she went to was a very sort of traditionalist. It was a Methodist church,
Yeah, it
wasn't
was Methodist.
Yeah, and it seems like it was a very traditionalist approach, whereas the only person in my family who, I mean, my grandmother went to church. My parents didn't go to church until my mum started going, as I mentioned earlier, and I went along with her. But I think she was going really for the social aspect, because we moved house and she wanted to meet people in the local community, and that was one way of doing it. But I mean, when I think back, my great uncle was in the High Church of England, and he was actually a minister. I mean, that was not all he did, but he was a minister, and he was quite highly respected. And there was a great sense that he was someone that was to be taken very seriously because of who he was and his position in the community and all the rest of it. And so there was a respect accorded to the religion because of him, because of Uncle Frank, but who was also my godfather as well, I should say. So there was all that combined made me take it seriously. But the reason I mentioned progressivism is because Uncle Frank, who was a minister, and he gave me a book, which I've still got, when I was a little kid, called The First Living Things. And it was a book about evolution. And it was a book about how life began on Earth. But it wasn't a religious book. It wasn't a Christian book about how life evolved on Earth. It was a scientific picture book for kids about how life evolved on Earth. So that tells me that Uncle Frank was somebody who didn't take the story of Genesis literally, who took it metaphorically, and who had a progressive attitude towards his religion. And I know from the other things he did in his life and his career that he was someone who was very progressive. So I just wanted to make the point that it's not all literalist.
No.
I think that the other thing that I wanted to touch on, and the thing that put me off the religion, going to church, was not the same as you. I didn't go and see it as just figures of fun, but the thing that really used to get to me was this sense of putting humanity down, this very anti-humanist thing of putting humanity down, this sin, people are sinners, people are wicked. And
Well, that's the ultimate control tool, isn't it?
well,
really?
yes.
I mean, that's certainly a way to bring people to heel.
Yeah, well, there's screeds that you could say about, the church using hell and sin and concepts like that as a means of keeping people in line. But I mean, even, when I was a kid, going to church, and there was, when we used to go for the Easter service and things like that, this was an Anglican church, and you'd hear the minister read his liturgy from the prayer book. And there was one line that I always remember in some prayer or other that they used to do, and they probably still do it in the Anglican church, where he used to say, "Lord, we are not so much as worthy as to gather up the crumbs under your table." And every time I used to hear that line, I used to think, what a terrible thing to say about human beings and to think about human beings, that we're not even worthy enough to gather up the crumbs under your table. That we're just like mice.
Yeah, well,
or less than mice. I always used to think of mice, going under the table, getting the crumbs.
Yeah, well, I would interpret that as being horrific, to be quite honest, because pastoral care is not just words. You would think it would be the job of anybody in a religious organisation to be looking out for the psychological well-being of the parishioners.
But there is, because they do have that whole concept of pastoral care. So that's definitely the case.
But
they are meant to be looking out for their parishioners' psychological well-being.
To be actually putting people down and making people feel unworthy is possibly one of the worst, most damaging things that an organisation or an institution could do, especially to children. I mean, but no less for adults as well, because from that low bar, it's very difficult, when you have the authority of such a powerful institution, to rise up from that and to actually be able to assess things as a well-functioning psychological being. And that's something that I take great exception to with a lot of these organised religions, because it seems as though there is no obligation from their part to even attempt to address anything psychological. It's all indoctrination, and it's all control of their parishioners as much as they can. And to me, that is stifling, you would think, for the individual in their pursuit for life and happiness.
Well, but there is pastoral care, but they do say that they...
But pastoral care isn't
I mean,
that
sometimes
really...
that can be just come along to church again,
I know.
or do some
There's
Bible study.
All different types. And no disrespect to anybody who does provide pastoral care, because I know they provide invaluable services when people are close to death. But
well, it's not just that. I mean, they do...
I know,
pastoral care includes, looking after the homeless, looking after people...
It's more a matter of being able to empower people to be their... It's a cliche, but to be their better selves. That's something I don't observe the religious organisations. They don't seem to see that as being their role.
Well, it's true. I mean, you have to ask the question, why should a religious institution be exempt from looking after the psychological well-being of its constituents?
It's almost as though it's predetermined that the people that they're caring for or giving some kind of pastoral care, it's almost as though that's predetermined that those people will be in that position, and it's their role to just comfort them in the position that they're in.
Well, there's several things that we could say about. Several things spring to mind for me. First of all, pastoral care, as it applied to the Methodist private school that I went to for a couple of years, which was a joke, and pastoral care at the private school you went to, the boarding school, which was that Methodist as well?
No, that was Presbyterian.
Presbyterian, okay.
Well, it's like any institution. The prime interest of the institution is preserving the institution. And this is something.
Well, yes, because if the pastoral care just consists of finding comfort through God or finding comfort through prayer, that's going to be pretty limited, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is actually. There are practical things that these organisations do as well as providing food and sustenance, but it's more a matter of how do they help people get out of those circumstances.
Practical help.
Practical.
Yeah, but a lot of them do. A lot, let's give credit where it's due. A lot of religious organisations do have charity arms. The Salvation Army, the Sydney City Mission to St Vincent de Paul, which is a Catholic organisation, and they have people working hard to help people find homes, housing, shelter, food, clothing, all sorts of things. They do, and they have people that are very sincere and hardworking.
For sure, and I acknowledge that. But again, there isn't really an element that they feel is part of their care that involves trying to build the particular people up emotionally and psychologically.
I think sometimes there are people in those organisations that are trying to do that. There's also a point to be made that there is value to what religion offers in terms of consolation, as the Catholic Church calls it, which not is in terms of a consolation prize, but in terms of consoling you, giving you comfort, making you feel safe. So what would we say about that? There is value in that, surely.
Yeah, definitely. But I don't think you necessarily need the scripture to do that. I don't think you actually need the structure of those institutions in order to be able to do that. Would be what I would say to that.
But I know that you're really into, for example, I know you're really into gospel music. So...
Yeah.
And that is not because you believe in the religious aspect of the music, just because of how the music touches you emotionally. And
the fact that I think that it's based around love, I think, and the metaphor that for a lot of the black churches in America, it is about love. God is love. Now, I don't know anyone who.
But that's not an exclusively black church concept.
It's not exclusively
black. That's a
black,
broad Christian concept.
Yeah.
God is love is right there in the Bible.
For sure.
So.
But again, they kind of embody it through the struggle.
For you.
For me.
Yeah.
Through their struggle.
Yeah.
To survive and to become viable
members of the society.
They've
from slavery.
From slavery, and they've formulated this way of being able to transcend, and that absolutely I think is worthwhile. And obviously the musicality of their and the passion, their creativity when it comes to the music. I'm right there.
Yeah. Well. It's kind of like a means of they found some way to transcend their plight, didn't they?
Yeah, they did.
Through music.
Yep.
I think. And not just music, but through the whole religion, the whole.
And it was a way to bind their people together.
Yeah.
And to get that power through comforting each other through this joyful experience. And certainly that wouldn't be something that I would think any reasonable person would think is bad.
No.
It's a good thing. And that's certainly, I'm not sort of saying that all white churches, I don't want to make it sort of a racial thing, but a lot of what I was exposed to, it didn't seem to be about those things at all.
No, maybe if you'd grown up in a black church,
if I had grown
up, it would be different.
Yes, absolutely.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Because to me, there wasn't anything to actually hold you there. And that's why I've long suspected that a lot of the reasons why people go are just primal needs, primarily, like belonging to a particular group, wanting some kind of safety and surety.
I think a lot of it is just identity.
Yeah. Well,
tribal, being part of a group.
Well, it's like, this is how I see it in the Western...
That is what makes... Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's what makes sense to me of what I was saying earlier, this idea that you can be, a member of this particular religious denomination, not know anything about what it claims to teach, not really know what the doctrines are, or even be interested enough to find out what the doctrines are, or even understand the doctrines, or even read the scriptures, as a lot of people don't, but still want to be part of that organisation. So it must be some other driving force, some other sense of identity that you're getting from it, beyond what it stands for or what it means by its own precepts, if you see what I mean.
For sure. And that's why I was saying before, it's like a primal need to be part of a particular group, that you're there with other people you identify with.
Striving as human beings to get past that?
Well, I would argue that for sure. But again, that's my perspective based on how religion was introduced to me as a child. I just have never actually had those needs. I can look at it from afar and give the opinions that I've given. I can't know their perspective, the perspective of parishioners who go for whatever needs they have. It's just very difficult to reconcile the whole experience of attending these religious services, though, and not think of the fact that it seems so human. It's meant to be transcendental, it's meant to be otherworldly and godlike, and yet I never ever see that. All I ever see is like a human reference. It's a human driver, a human expectation, a human need, a human want.
So couldn't we replace it with something more humanist?
Yes, that's right. And I mean, it seems really obvious that point, but it's more a matter of if you disengage your brain when you go there, and that you're willing to allow...
I don't know if everyone who goes disengages their brain.
Well, that's what I thought I witnessed as a child, was people going there.
That's your perspective.
Yeah, and while they were sitting there listening to the service, it's like they disengaged and they just absorbed whatever was coming, and then as soon as the service was finished and they were out the front of the church talking, it's like they just resumed their normal lives. And I remember being quite astounded.
That was my impression too as a kid, I must say.
Listening to the conversations and just how it's almost as though they hadn't heard a word that was said inside the service, and that they broke every single message and the spirit of the message. That's like they transgressed immediately the moment they got outside the church. And I kind of thought, well, what is all this about? Why do they go?
Well, which leads us back to what you were saying before about...
I mean, is it just to absolve themselves of any responsibility for their actions? I often think that must be one of the reasons people go. Obviously, fear of death and the unknown of what happens when you die. People like to hedge their bets as to whether there's going to be a vehicle for them after they die.
That's the old Pascal's wager. But, I mean, really, there's a very strong argument against that, which is that God is not so dumb that he doesn't know if you're trying to hedge your bets.
That's right.
So...
Well, again, you would think these things would be obvious, but, it's...
Anyway, I mean, there's obviously a lot more to cover. I think we have to wrap it up for now. But I think that's a good starting point. But we'll return to the topic, and there's a lot of other things to talk about just from some of the things you were just raising. Obviously, there's a lot of things to say about scripture, and there's a lot of things to say about the psychological aspect. So we'll come back to that. But thank you for joining us today for this first discussion.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Alex, for this stimulating conversation.
And thank you. And we'll be back with another episode soon.